Okay, so um, I thought this would be interesting. So I don't know who's on the security announced list. I always get the emails from Aaron Patterson, and I know that my day just got grand. Um, so usually what ends up happening is one of these gyms has a CVE and it has a fix. And so then I have a few dozen applications that I have to go visit and do something like a get checkout. And then, well, at first I read the announcement. Oh, let me actually share my screen. That would make far more sense for everyone. Screen two. Wait, screen. Yeah, it's this one. So y'all should see this screen here with the infinite thing going on. So the first thing I do whenever I look at these is I go ahead and read the CVE. Okay. So this is going to give you some good information. And so the first thing I'm going to look at is, okay, RCE is generally bad. Okay, what's going on? YAML serialized columns. Okay, affected versions all, not affected none. And I'm like, well, all my Rails apps are going to need updating. So then I look down at the examples and you'll see, okay, serialize options, and for an array, that's vulnerable. Okay, so any of my projects that use this capability are going to have this problem. So then I'll go and review all my dozen Rails apps that I maintain and um, and go from there. So they're all Dockerized. So what I can usually do is I'll create a text file that is kind of my steps. So I'm going to copy, because I'm going to do this a dozen times. I'm going to go to one project. I'm going to create this branch. I'm going to pull up a console. I'm going to do this to temporarily install bundler audit. I'm going to see the results. Then, okay, well, the fix for all these is bundle update ActiveRecord in Rails. Then that's going to usually build. Then I run all the test suite. Then, okay, I'm going to make a commit. Here's my message. I'm going to copy and paste into the commit. Exact formatting could vary for what you need. And then here's what I'm going to do with my pull request. So I can paste that in when I do a push, and then GitHub says, would you like to click this link to create a pull request? And then I have this, quick right there. So now it's a matter of letting all of the local tests run and CI. And when you're doing 12 apps, I'm usually doing this. CI sometimes can take a long time. So I'm going to start running the regression suites on my desktop and my laptop simultaneously for different projects. I just kind of have an action plan that I go through when one of these CVEs drops. So I also prioritize my clients based on their need. So for example, a regulated industry client is going to get updated soon before I worry about a startup that's not really in production yet. For example, like a government agency client who may have increased risk of so you triage. You have a priority order and you come to that through some reasonable fair process of need. So then you basically wait for the test to pass. And for a lot of these, hey, no biggie. The test all passed, so then you do a deploy. Um, and go from there. Any questions so far about, I mean, this isn't quite the technical side, but this is sort of a business process and how I organize my work so that I can move fast. I try to keep it pretty consistent for each of them. Okay, cool. So I did all this last night from about 9 o'clock on, and by about 10, I knew that most of the apps were working, easy to deploy. But one of my applications, which is a regulated industry client, unfortunately broke badly. I don't have a copy and paste of the exact errors, but it was things like psych error, tried to load unsafe um, unsafe value symbol or something. I'm butchering. It's like one of those low level errors. And I'm sorry I can't show you all the code. I didn't kind of prepare this, and I can't show you that application as a whole. But my first assumption was that this was the YAML loads on some YAML file, like English.yaml or some other translation. There's a dozen languages in this application. And so I started going through and updating those. There was a seeds file that loaded seeds from a YAML file, and it was blowing up in the seeds, and it was a very low level exception, and I thought it was the YAML load at the top of that file, and I went down this path, and so I started, okay, well, obviously this pull request, this update changed the way YAML works, which, by the way, it did not. That was just my assumption at the time. So I started updating it to use whitelisted attributes and so forth. But tests were still failing. I was like, how is this possible? Like, this doesn't work. And I would copy and paste the line in console and it would work. And it's like, how can this, what is going on? Because of course the exception didn't have a line number on it. That would be too easy. So, what I finally came to realize is that this wasn't the YAML load that was happening. This was lower down where an assignment was made to the model that was being populated. And so it really was the serialized column. And so if activity was the thing that was serialized, then at the time, that looked like this, which is exactly, what is here. So the ActiveRecord update causes the serialization to break certain ways. And maybe there's some ways to whitelist stuff, but the recommendation is to convert to JSON like this. Well, I can switch that out to JSON, run the tests, and see if they work or not, find out that, well, now anything that tried to pull a symbol out needs to convert that to a string. Fix up the test pass. But what about my existing data? So the first thing I did was I worked on this morning, actually. I at 12:30, I was seeing cross-eyed, and I had a regulated industry client in the medical field that couldn't be deployed this security fix. So I had to do an assessment. Okay, this risk, while not zero, is less, the risk of an attack that uses this vulnerability while not zero is in the next 12 hours is less than the risk that if I try to deploy this thing now, bleary-eyed in the middle of the night, thousands of users are going to wake up in the morning to a non-functioning system. So the risk here, what is easy is hard, not because it's hard, but because of the stakes involved. Okay? So I made the decision to go to bed and get up in the morning after doing those things. Of course, you communicate, and I did run this by a coworker to make sure I wasn't saying, no, I don't see a risk here. No, two of us looked at this together and, made the determination that we could go a little slow on this, because we had other mitigations. We don't have any, Brakeman doesn't flag any SQL injection vulnerabilities. We're pretty tight on a lot of other aspects. So you would have to do something else to take advantage of this vulnerability, which is specifically that someone who can manipulate one of these values could use that manipulation to do a remote code execution. Does everyone know what a remote code execution is when you read things like CVEs and vulnerabilities?
Nope, I don't.
Ah, okay, Gamir. Uh, what this means uh, is that there's a bug, and the YAML can be used to serialize executable code. And when it gets deserialized in the application, it's actually as if that's code that existed in one of your files in your program, and it actually executes on the server remotely, hence the term remote code execution, code that you did not write, but it now can do anything that your application could do. It can steal any data that your application can read and so forth. That's a remote code execution vulnerability.
I see, I see. So it's basically giving you like a vulnerability report, letting you know you might have some holes in your application security wise.
No, that's not what I explained. Are you talking about the CVE email itself being a vulnerability report?
Yeah. So the email contains RCE that you said.
No. Okay. So this email is an announcement. So a CVE is called a common vulnerabilities and exposure. So when you run a tool like Bundler Audit, it's going to look against this formalized database of public vulnerabilities. This email is Aaron Patterson's on the Rails core team and is often works with security issues. So the Rails core team released an update to ActiveRecord, and then they responsibly disclosed that all Rails applications, every single one of them, that's what this not affected none means, has this could have this security vulnerability and needs to take steps to mitigate it via code changes and updating the libraries that are used. Update the gems. And until such time that you do that, your application that is running in the world on the internet right now could be vulnerable to be hacked via this previously unknown, undisclosed vulnerability that's already there in your Rails app, just because it's a Rails app.
I understand better now. Gotcha.
Cool. So,
Sorry, I don't understand how you subscribe to the CVE.
oh, I'm on the Rails security announce email list.
Okay.
This is just the link to the group, but if in my email I got yeah, there's a Rails security announce email list. I would join that.
Funny, it's I didn't read it, but I saw on some kind of feed that they did this major release, minor points updates for all these Rails versions, and I was like, cool, and I didn't even click it. So whoops.
I usually just pay attention to the GitHub Actions bot for any vulnerabilities.
That is a good source, though. I find it lags about 20 to 20 hours or more behind the mailing list.
Talking about Dependabot?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it shows up eventually. And again, I'm hired by clients to stay on top of security, so keeping my ear to the beat of these various projects email lists is one of my sources of earlier warning. So okay, let's look at some code. So now let's say we update activity and the other models that use this serialized mechanism to store structured data in a otherwise text field. And if I were building this application in PostgreSQL instead of MySQL, I would probably use a JSON data type field which is a supported data type rather than storing it as a string. But since this application already existed and already used Serialize and is on MySQL, and the data is not in JSON, it's in Serialized YAML, I just went ahead and put the comma JSON there. But I can't deploy this yet because immediately if I deployed this, I'm going to start throwing 500 exceptions because these fields records won't even be able to load, because when it goes to execute the deserialization, it's not going to be in JSON format and it's going to blow up. So I did some researching and I came across this gist from 10 years ago where Daniel Evans had done some work with a serialize that, you know, had some YAML, and he wanted to switch it to JSON and demonstrated doing this find in batches using this since he can't use the new class because it can't load, actually using this dynamic method of creating a nameless class. I forget what this is called in Ruby, but it's an anonymous class that inherits from ActiveRecord base, and then you tell it the table. And so this lets you actually create an ActiveRecord model on top of the table that doesn't have any of the business logic or code from the real model itself. But you can use it to read and then update records. And so then the money line is on 11, where he used YAML.load to load to parse the previous YAML encoded data, and then use .toString to turn it into one second, it's my wife. She's just gonna need my help with the kids before long. The YAML, you load the YAML, convert it to JSON, update the field. Great. So based on this information, I started to create a migration, and I started with one of the tables called resources, which has two fields. One is languages and one is localized data. And I started doing it really just like this, but I was like, you know, there's going to be some edge cases. I'm going to have to troubleshoot this. I got to do it 5 times in 3 different tables. I'm going to go ahead and create a helper object in my lib folder. And so I ended up creating this. I ended up creating convert YAML field to JSON, which is initialized with an object and a table name just so that the debug logger stuff can be written out. And it's going to do this magical invocation to ask the object for the value of this particular field. And you'll notice that the attribute array is based on strings instead of symbols. Anyway, so get the value, and then for safety, it's like, okay, is the current value blank? But I'm not just going to check for blank. Is it a blank-like thing? So I'm going to go ahead and cast it to a string, since nil.toString is an empty string. I'm going to strip it. I'm going to remove the any white space, and I'm going to ask, is it blank? Okay, if so, there's nothing I can do with this field. I'm skipping. Next, is it JSON, which I wrote out here. It is not JSON unless it starts with an open bracket, or so this is a fast check. And then the slower check is try to parse it, and if it parses successfully, it's JSON. Otherwise, if there was an error, it's not JSON. So I used this mechanism to give me a true false, is it JSON? If it's JSON, I simply say, hey, this is already JSON, I don't need to do anything, skip it. Else, YAML values as text start with 3 dashes. So I said, okay. And I started using this YAML safe load symbol, and you'll see some other things here, and I'll get to this in a second. Load it and then update it and then run. And this worked really well Oh, and then the edge case, I always want to explain what the else condition is. I didn't want to just say, okay, I can do that here, even if this shouldn't happen. Then the migration was like this. Resources was a table that had a few dozen records. And so it ran in all my local tests. I would go back to the master branch, recreate the test database, run it again, because it's not really something you can test with a RSpec. At that point, I ended up having migrations also for the other two tables, deployed it to staging, emailed the client's team to explain, one, the situation, two, that we had a thing into staging to get them to look through it and make sure it seemed to work. Got permission to deploy to production at 4 o'clock this afternoon, which is an emergency maintenance window during business hours. But, we thought we had something that was work. And then during the deploy process got through the code, started running, took a database backup, because you always take a database backup. And then started the deploy, and it got through resources, and then it hit the activities table, and then after a couple of minutes it crashed and rolled back. But the rollback was not perfect because MySQL and the way it works with transactions, the database has been changed, though the code was not deployed. This is bad. So this means that I now have a situation where production, even though it worked testing, it worked on staging, it broke when we were doing a production deploy during an emergency maintenance window in the middle of the day. So ended up doing a few more hot fixes, pull requests, and ultimately decided that this deploy cannot fail, because I could try to do a rollback, but if I roll back the database, I run the risk of losing any data that any of the hundreds of users of the system may have introduced in the minutes since I took the backup before this process started. So even though that's still an option, it's a very suboptimal one. So the next step was to allow, because the resource table was the most important, because it's actually used for some of the screens, like it's like to load like translations of certain information. That's the localization data fields. It's like database stored localizations. So I ended up taking this migration stuff and creating a rake task to do this data stuff. So the idea is, okay, these migrations cannot fail. So I turned them into no ops, and then I moved this logic into rake tasks using the converter, got that deployed so that the app deployed all the way, and the new code using the JSON fields rotated into production. And then I consoled in and started the process. One, I was like, just a spot check, because staging wasn't so bad. It worked in staging. The activity table had like 9.8 million records in it, and another had like 1.9 million records. And so if you try to do an each without this find in batches on tables that size, it will actually crash. The Rails process will shut down, or you'll get disconnected depending on exact. So you have to do find in batches, and when you do find in batches, that's going to give you an enumeration. So you actually then have to have an inner loop that enumerates through the results of this batch, but then the logic can be the same as was this. And you'll notice I use this helper object to do these so that I could use them in several migrations or several places without having to do a bunch of copy and paste.
Did you, Frank, decide specifically not to put like a sleep in between there? You weren't afraid of like a database lock issue going on? Because I'm pretty sure it starts a transaction around those like batches. when they start. So I don't know if like
I wouldn't want to put a sleep for sure, but
okay.
I suppose I could have surrounded a transaction around the batch, but in this case, I didn't in this particular case. It's probably a good idea. I'm actually looking at the window now. It's still running several hours later on just that activities. So I'm gonna have to run this on events later tonight, and I have to do all of this before I can deploy the underlying gem update, because if I deploy that gem update before this is done, it gets worse and it definitely would have more breakage. But right now, actually, I probably could do that since we've now converted to JSON on those columns. So I guess the rationale is it started out as update the gems. Then it was like, okay, stuff broke. Okay, we can convert this to JSON. But wait, if we do that, now we have a real problem. So we have to do a pull request and a deploy to convert to the JSON field type before we do a pull request or deploy to update the gem to apply the security update for the CVE.
I thought the CVE only affected YAML. So if you did convert it over to JSON, then it's not
as urgent,
vulnerable anymore.
It is not as urgent, though. When you work in a regulated industry where other parties look at reports about like dependencies, they see red, and that's bad for you. So,
yeah.
But yes, you are right. Once you do that conversion, you are mitigating that risk with or without the gem bump. But still, you have this chicken and egg problem. Now, there are other strategies potentially that could be a zero downtime approach. You could take out the serialization at all and duplicate it with a setter and a getter. So in theory, and this isn't how I did this, but in theory, this looks something like parameters JSON.parse super. In theory, this is what serialize unpacks to in its simplest form. There might be some actual differences, of course, if you went and looked at it. So you could say, okay, I'm going to get rid of serialization and then do if value equals super, if JSON value probably do it more like this. I don't know. I'd have to test that, but you would do some logic like this. That's like, well, try it this way, and if not, return the other way. And then you could probably then rescue and trigger, or you probably could do like a self update parameters. Probably do it this way. To return equals return to return. I don't know. I mean, you could come up with something like this, but the lesson here is that a lot of times in Rails, these declarative statements actually unpack into methods that are actually fairly simple methods, and you could duplicate them or do an analogous implementation in place. I didn't take this approach, so I'd have to test or play with that idea. But what I did do was...
I ask, oh, okay.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so I am wondering if it would be a good idea to do a test run by, I'm genuinely asking, I don't know, by backing up your database and then loading that back up and running, your scripts against that, that basically your test database now.
In theory, yes, that would require having the resources in the production environment to do that. And in this very particular case, there's external legal restrictions on copies of the production database that come into play about the citing about exactly when to do that. Like I would not, for example, definitely would not be able to download a copy of the backup to outside of their cloud down to my system to run tests.
Okay.
Like that would be a security. Well, I should stop short of calling it a security incident, but that would not be an appropriate thing to do.
We've come full circle to why you need to have PII scrubbing set up ahead of time.
Some PII is more equal than others. That was a bad reference to Animal Farm. In this particular case, I have to keep a journal that I logged into SSH and what my business purpose for connecting to SSH and what the outcome of my work was. And I believe we're supposed to keep those logs for 7 years because they are subject to investigation by like legal authorities. Because I might have accessed EPHI using my administrative privileges. Outside of the realm of the normal audit trail. Anyway, Nelson, you're right. And in a previous environment, I definitely would have done that a lot. Pull a dump of the database and test the snot out of it against that to uncover these things sooner. I suppose in this particular case, I guess there could be what you would call a user acceptance testing environment, but this is an example of where their staging environment is still in the cloud, but doesn't have real patient data, but their production environment is patient data. And so I can take a backup of that and leave it, but I didn't have, I mean, I guess in theory, I don't think it is illegal for us to have an environment that is a test environment with production data, but I definitely can't remove that data from that blessed account, cloud. So it would definitely need to be a clone of that database and then in that environment. So it probably is doable. I guess this is one of those examples of external considerations that are not purely technical in nature.
Sounds very restrictive.
And I'm glad it's restrictive, because otherwise you would have a bunch of yahoos with your private information, whether it's a credit company like Equifax or payroll company with your bank account information, just copying your data off to a maybe perhaps not as a secure environment that is vulnerable to attack. And then you're in a whole heap of mess.
Yep. So I did get to use this faux model pattern, which I think is pretty cool. And the code's been running for the last, 2 hours now on this table without error. So it seems to be doing a decent job converting these older records. It's just going to take some time. I'm not saying this was the right way, but this is the way I came up with the day when faced with this situation.
Yeah. What version of Rails is this application using?
Let me turn off and check. I believe we got it up to 6, so it's like 6.0 dot. Well, let me check before I say that. It was a Rails 5 app when we first got it, or maybe it was 4.
Okay.
But now it is at 6.0.5.
Okay. There is upsert that was released in Rails 6.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do an upsert all. So you can basically take your activities. You have your initial find in batches. Then you have your activities. And if you did like a each 1,000,
Mm-hmm.
so you are doing 1,000 at a time, you can create a hash of 1,000 records and you upload or upsert those 1,000 records all at the same time in one transaction or one SQL query instead of one at a time. And that would speed it up significantly.
Ooh, that is a decent idea.
Just throwing it out there if you wanted to stay up later.
At this point, I'm probably going to see if this runs through successfully, but I mean, that would have been a good idea. Well, any questions about this craziness? And Dave, and Nelson, I do appreciate the feedback there. I really do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate the presentation. I mean, there's a lot of things that you're doing that I'm not. It's my first time seeing.
Like in some of my crazy Ruby hacks, or sort of the regulated industry support kind of talking about.
Yeah, the Ruby hacks, the regulated industry stuff, the subscriptions to CVE, the use of tools like bundler audit that you mentioned earlier on, a lot of things.
Awesome. I'm glad to be helpful. One of the things that I personally struggle with, because some of these tools I've used for so long, I don't have a baseline to appreciate that not everyone knows about them. Oh yeah, it's just this thing I use. So like I might say, oh, by the way, yeah, blah blah blah. You're like, wait, what was that?
Yeah.
No, that's my problem in life.
In the time we've been meeting, you gave me the heads up that there was a security vulnerability. I checked GitHub. My code was vulnerable. I updated it. You talked about bundler audit. I installed the gem. I ran it. I'm clean. I'm actively listening.
Awesome. Awesome. So obviously most apps or many apps don't use Serialize, either because there are better solutions like using the JSON database type column, which one of the reasons that if I were writing this from scratch, and maybe in the future I will convert these fields to a native. I think there's a MySQL JSON field. I guess off the top of my head, don't know because I use PostgreSQL more, but I know PostgreSQL has it. And one of the benefits is you can actually query the JSON structure. So it has native support, and you can actually say, like, find me the records where this JSON subfield has this value in it. And that's pretty cool. Instead of just a substring search, which you would have to do, since by using the serialize JSON method, it's a Ruby on Rails feature, but to the database, it's just a string. Like Rails is just giving it a string, parsing the string. The database has no, like you're not using any of the power of the database engine with that field content.
I don't serialize to JSON. Should I be doing that?
If you're using Serialize, yes, that is. You may run into the problem though that if you didn't specify it as the CVE, let me send you a link down here. The default option Serialize uses YAML still, and maybe it works in some cases, but it definitely blew up on stuff that this app was using it for after the update.
Well, I'm not using serialize at all. Maybe that's
Then in theory you
deficient.
don't have this problem,
Okay.
which is a good thing. I instead of using Serialize, if you wanted to store structured data in a field, I would recommend a native JSON type field in your database schema. What you can look up, there are times that the underlying database has field types that Rails doesn't officially support because Rails is trying to support multiple databases. But in those cases, there's always a way to make a migration that uses that field type. So just because it's not, like, if you want to use a field type that's the right choice for you, and you're not going to be migrating between different databases, then there's no reason not to use it just because, Rails doesn't have you can do a code fragment in your migration to generate the DDL data definition language statements to generate that in your schema. If you get too far off the reservation, sometimes you have to switch your schema.rb to be a structure.sql. But actually, schema.rb does support a lot. Dave, you have anything to add to that? I'm sure you've run into that before.
Around the schema and structure, yeah, with PostgreSQL, if you try to do named, or if you try to use enums, like true enums as a data type within PostgreSQL, then you can't use the schema.rb. You do have to convert it over to a structure SQL.
And there are tricks to make the Rails, the ActiveRecord enums work compatibly with the true PostgreSQL enums.
Yeah.
You just have to, there are blog posts that explain it. It's not hard. It's a little duplicative. Like, you have to say, like, in your enum, you have to be like, start, and then the string start. Like, because you're defining the value instead of a number, and then you make that align with your native enum values. But then the benefit is your database will outright raise an exception and refuse to accept data that is not valid towards its structure. So one of the most powerful things about having a properly formatted, a properly defined database schema is that properly defined database schema will protect you from invalid data getting into your database in ways that are hard to do with just application level validation alone.
Yeah. And they did make a change for Rails 7 where they do support the enum data type in PostgreSQL. So you now don't have to switch over on a Rails 7 application, but previous versions you still would.
That's super useful. Well, y'all, this concludes my off the cuff remarks. I literally was working on this up till about 6:10 tonight, and then I've been monitoring over on this other monitor, the progress. So this is real for me right now. Kind of like I said, it is not hard. Hey, there's an update. Do you use Serialize? Yes, no. No, then not vulnerable. Yes. Do you use JSON? Yes, no. Okay, you should convert your files. None of that's hard, but when the stakes are higher, that you have to come up with a triage approach to reduce the risk that users of your system are going to experience a poor result where they're trying to do their work and they get a 500 error and they don't know why. It just broke. Yeah. So
I guess the real question,
hanging out there in an insecure way.
I guess the real question is, why are you storing translations in the database?
I have no idea. That was a design decision made before me.
You know what though? I've seen worse. I've seen translations stored in a XLS file, an Excel file, and they had a rake task that ran on each release that then converted it over into a JavaScript file that was just an array of hashes with the translations and the symbols, and then they would load that into the front end. It was a nightmare.
One of the, if I could just share one piece of just mental thought with, yes, that is awful. I've seen it.
You can't have two people working on it because it's a binary file.
Yeah.
You would have
Oh
a
my
PR
gosh.
of the entire thing. It's crazy.
And so Git can't manage it at all either. It's just a blob. Your question, why are you doing that? Why don't you just change those to the proper way? Well, is it a priority? Does it work? Is there a priority? You know, does the budget allow to clean it up? You know, so if there was one thing I could teach everyone who's kind of new to development, or kind of like the blog intellectual like circle of, you're not going to need it, you know, don't premature optimize, like those are good thoughts and that is useful, but it is temporary as permanent. Like I if we could just remember, like it's not so easy to just go change it later. And so, you know, you or someone else are going to be stuck with this years and years down the road. It doesn't mean you need to go, you know, gold plate it, you know, well beyond the need. But, you know, we have like a throwaway culture that thinks, oh, this is just a short-term solution, it'll be fixed later. Sometimes that is the most permanent thing that you'll ever see. And that's the end of it. That's just kind of the thought. And I know it's a bit hand wavy, but I've seen it so many times.
Oh yeah, I can relate. So
Well, I mean, that's the cost of delivering something quickly, right?
It's one of them, yeah.
You make these quick decisions that, or you know, you do something for the short term, but it's more costly in the long term.
yep. Yeah, back when AWS S3 was brand new, there was not much trust in the platform. You know, our company was still self-hosting everything in data centers. And so I needed some kind of storage bucket, and they would not let me use S3. And they didn't want to provision another virtual machine for a file store or anything like that. And I was only going to be storing 5 kilobyte images. You know, nothing big. I mean, it's not crazy or anything. It's only 5 kilobytes. And so we just stored it as a blob in the database. Many years later, that database is over 200 gigabytes now. And that table has upwards of 100 million records. And it's still storing the images. And it's getting slower and slower, you know, each year. So it's like, and it's a legacy product.
I mean, yeah, that's tech debt, the interest. Yep. And when you finally get around to it, it becomes this like engineering effort, because to convert or do anything with that many records is an engineering effort. It's not just oh yeah, let's just go ahead and extract those out.
Just make a rate test. It'll run for a few months.
Yeah.
It'll be done.
Oh, there's another trick. If you need to SSH or connect to something that would time out, it's best to open a Biobu terminal or something first, because you can resume from that. So if you're SSH'd into something that can have that, fire up Biobu and then open up your Rails console or run your rake task. That way, if your SSH disconnects, the background process keeps running.
What is it?
Biobu, Byobu. It's a terminal. It's like a tabbing screen thing for remote SSH.
Oh,
Just
cool.
terminals. Yeah.
I've always used Screen.
Screen's the same, accomplishes the same
Okay.
sort of thing.
Okay.
Beavo gives you some like status at the bottom. It's kind of cool, like how many processors, what the CPU, gives you some other stats, but it accomplishes the same thing as Screen.
Okay. Yeah.
It's kind of like
Unless
Screen
if it's
plus
a
plus.
pod running in Kubernetes, in which case if that pod dies, you're screwed.
Yeah, buddy.
So I've had that happen a few times.
Another thing kind of here, I would point out is you can run long migrations, but you need to plan if a migration is going to run more than a minute or two. You probably need to break your change up into multiple stages and use another mechanism to do the data manipulation. You need to create a background job or a rake task. So you get the deploy done, then you run the rake task. So that you may need to plan out your feature so that it's like released over like 2 or 3 deploys. Like you deploy one thing, then you console in and do an administrative action via rake. Then you do another deploy. Like you may need to stage it out.
Yeah. And one thing you didn't mention, but I did see in your code, so I think it's one of those cases where it's just so common for you to do, but you didn't mention it, is idempotency. That your scripts, you can run that same script multiple times, and it's only going to change the value once. It's not then going to manipulate the data each time you run it. And I did see that you did have it, the proper checks in there, so it's only going to perform the action one time on that particular record instead of multiple times trying to reconvert, re-update, and stuff.
Oh yes. Oh yeah, just the if checks. Yeah, you gotta think it through, because then if this thing process crashes and you run it again, now you have to find a way of excluding all the ones that have already been done, or have some logic say, hey, I got nothing I need to do here.
Yeah.
You're right. I didn't even think of. I think I touched on having those if conditions, but I didn't touch on the why. So thank you.
Yep.
And it's really useful to have the word, because that's one of the things the senior devs taught me was word idempotency. And now that I have the word, I do it whenever it's required, like it's when it's relevant. But if just it wouldn't have been as memorable if someone had said, "Oh, just do some if checks at the beginning."
Yeah, good call, y'all. Thank you. Well, I probably ought to go and help try to get my daughter down. My wife texted me about 30 minutes ago saying I need you soon, but I told her I was talking with you guys and she was very gracious about it. So thank you, Danielle, for letting me finish my little presentation.
I'm in the same boat, Frank. 25% of my kids are in bed already.
Yeah.
I need to go deal with the other 75%.
There you go. Well, I appreciate y'all for listening and, being gentle with sort of the, why didn't you do it this way or that way? It's like, all these are valid ways. But I had to make some rapid decisions based on an evaluation of risk, client communication about the status of the risk, both whether or not they're facing an imminent data breach, had a reportable incident or not, how to go about fixing this, minimizing downtime. So of all the things, you're like, oh yeah, let's do some software updates. My checklist of the things I have to do as a professional, like the technical aspect was like an hour and a half of poking around in Ruby and reading a couple things and trying it out. And then the rest of the day has been just navigating regulation and client communications and confirming and running and doing. So I think it's helpful to remember that the software we write is not just software. I guess that's a tautology. The work that we need to do is not merely the technical aspects of the work, but also how it interacts with users and the organizations and all that stuff. And it lives forever. This code's been running since 2008. It's been updated by who knows how many people. I'm going to have more updates to do to it eventually. And it also has weird edge cases that, you know, if it's not broke, don't fix it now. And it's interesting that it was using YAML encoding probably back when MySQL didn't even have the JSON field type. I mean, that just was from 10 years ago. So people were doing these conversions 10 years ago, but it's now that for this application, even with my team looking after it, again, you know, it wasn't on our radar because it wasn't considered a security vulnerability and it wasn't broken, so don't change it. Anyway. Thanks, Bill. Oh, yes. Nelson.
Oh, I was just wondering if you're adding new features to these projects, or if you're just maintaining them.
Sometimes, usually there will be a request for some small, hey, can you change this? Can you change that? For maintenance purposes, sometimes that change is small enough that it's like, yeah, we can work that in. Other times you have to go back and estimate it, and it usually involves a budget negotiation, what they want, how much they want to spend to get it, that sort of thing. This is like government and business agencies who are not running this from a standpoint of we have full-time developers on staff. So for us, we get paid a certain amount per month for the purpose of maintaining and updating and keeping secure applications that are otherwise don't have any developer on staff looking after them. Clients would love me to just add whatever they wanted without costing them extra money, but that is not what maintenance is. It's a decent business, Nelson, if you want to come over to the dark side of living in Brownfield all the time.
Well, who was it? Stack Overflow did a survey, and Ruby is one of the top paying programming languages.
Really?
I think it was number 3.
Okay.
Something like that.
Is the top what?
Top paid, programming languages.
Ah, okay.
So the first 2 were very legacy. I think it was COBOL, or
Yeah.
it was just like definitely senior people working on financial apps that
Right.
have lived, decades and decades.
I love it. I mean, that is a challenge, and that's a challenge for a lot of my clients too, because they don't have the financial resources to employ Ruby developers in a world that they're competing against these huge money-making companies.
Yeah.
So that is a real challenge. Well, cool, y'all. I better get going if I know what's good for me. Any final questions? Thank each and every one of you for coming. And I would love it if someone would volunteer or think about presenting next month at the August Atlanta Ruby Users Group. If anyone has, something on your mind you want to share.
I will present about debugging.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
August. Nelson, debugging. I appreciate you.
I better see some emojis in there, Nelson.
All right, I'll try.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.